Welcome back to Ask the Coroner, the podcast where we answer questions you've always wanted to know about death investigations. I'm Mark Hammond, the Boyd County Coroner.
I'm Bailey Rucker, Deputy Coroner.
So tonight's our first look at the biggest change in season 2. And I think this is going to be huge.
Yeah, this is fun. This is real fun.
So we have figured out a way that we wanted to bring you all different perspectives of death investigation. And that's our big thing, is to look at that and bringing in different guests from all over the world, really, and different backgrounds into this. So tonight we have partnered with Ron Jensen, and he has RonJensenSpeaks.com. He's out of Minnesota. And so we're welcome to have you.
Thanks, Mark, for having me on your show. I appreciate it. I'm excited for season 2.
We're growing, so this is a pretty neat thing, really. And so the way we're going to work this tonight is Bailey's going to ask some questions. We're just going to kind of get a background from Ron, and so we can inform everybody about how different states do different things, and then different people's perspectives on death investigation.
Yeah, so I think the first question, let's just get a little bit of a background from you, Ron. You had a little bit of time to introduce yourself. What would you want everybody to know?
Yeah, thank you, Bailey. So, where to start? So I basically started out my career in law enforcement. I was a police officer down at Prairie Island, which is a Indian reservation kind of down in just outside of Twin Cities, about a half an hour north of Minneapolis. I worked there for about 9 months as a police officer, and then from there I actually transitioned to a full-time job as a forensic tech for the Ramsey County Medical Examiner, which kind of covers the Ramsey, Washington, kind of St. Paul area. And for about 3.5 years there, I assisted the forensic pathologists with eviscerations and collecting evidence as a forensic tech. I probably did, I would say, over 3,000 autopsies in my time there. I worked 12 days on, 2 days off. It was a pretty crazy workload, as you guys know. And then from there, I worked my way up to an investigator. I got promoted, which I did for about 14 years full time. And then from there, I transitioned to the state of Minnesota, where I worked with crime victims, and I was also the VINE program manager. And then after that, where I'm currently at is I'm working for the Midwest Medical Examiner as a part-time on-call death investigator, and that's what I'm doing right now.
Wow. So what got you started into this work? Like, what made you jump into it from being a police officer going into death investigation?
Yeah, so the big jump for me was, I've always, kind of liked solving things, puzzles, just kind of putting pieces together. I actually ran into one of my good friends who was working at the local medical examiner's office, and I told him that I was, in law enforcement, and he basically told me, he's like, we're gonna be hiring for a part-time temp forensic tech, and I'm just like, well, what's a forensic tech? I had no idea. And he basically kind of told me that, you'll be assisting the doctors with eviscerations, collecting evidence. And then my first question was, well, if somebody passes away, don't they already know why they died? And he jokingly said, we do unnatural deaths, things like car accidents and homicides and suicides. So I kind of, thought that was really interesting, and I applied, and I started out as a temp, and then from there I never looked back. So, it just kind of drew me as far as trying to figure out things and putting pieces together and ultimately giving family answers is really what kind of drew me.
And we kind of had this as a myth. We talked about myths in season 1.
Yeah.
And one of the myths was, I think everybody assumes people in law enforcement really know a lot about death investigation, but really they don't. And in turn, I think that's a big myth. I don't know what your opinion is, but that's what we found out when we looked at this.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Mark. We take a couple of classes when we're going through the police academy as far as death investigations 101, I guess, if you want to call it that. But you really don't know what you're getting into. And even officers that, newer officers that I go out to death scenes with now, outside of them, doing perimeter security and kind of passing on demographic information as far as family, who's who, It really does take a lot of repetition and time from a law enforcement perspective to understand exactly what the role of medical examiner is and what your role to help them out is. And that's something that as an officer, we had a couple death scenes, but I was very new to law enforcement, and it's something that I really didn't know a lot about.
I think this field kind of grabs you. Once you're in it,
Yeah,
it's like you kind of get hooked.
you go in it for the long haul.
Yes.
I mean, and you're exactly right. You do go in it for the long haul, and it kind of consumes you, I think.
Yeah, for me, the biggest thing that I didn't know going into it was just the emotional, toll and stress. I mean, I knew the job would be stressful, but for me having kids and just kind of, not want to be a helicopter dad and bring that stuff home, you really do need to learn how to kind of shut it off in a way, kind of, compartmentalize it the best you can, but yeah, you still need to kind of deal with it too. So it's definitely a balance that I had to learn over the years, but something that I definitely wasn't prepared for when I first started in the field.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
one thing that I wanted to talk about was your position now. And this is something that we covered a lot on the last episode and in season one. You're labeled as a part-time death investigator with the medical examiner's office. So
Mhm.
how how do you feel about part-time death investigation, like that term together? And then what does it actually look like?
Yeah, great question. So, um, the biggest thing for me, so like I said earlier, I started full time, and what my shifts were when I worked full time, they're actually 24-hour shifts where we're physically at the actual morgue, and then we would have a day off, and we would work 16 hours. So I essentially, when I was full time, I was working 40 hours in 3 days, which to me, looking back, I don't know how I did it for so long. Right now, being labeled part-time, I love the flexibility of it. I'm not actually at the medical examiner's office, so I get a phone call. I go out to the scene and respond, meet law enforcement. But then once I'm done with the scene investigation, I can actually go back home and I can actually type my reports. The workload is, to me, it's a lot less because I'm not doing it 24 hours straight. And it is a smaller county versus, St. Paul that I covered where there was, 186,000 people. So the type of cases are different, but I love part-time now, and it's a way better family balance than it was before. I can go to softball games. I'm not working every holiday. So I do have more flexibility part-time versus my previous role.
And I think a lot of people we have in a bigger city, you have the part-time or you have full-time and part-time, and they fill the shifts and everything works just like a normal job would. But there's a lot of places out there across the country that truly consider quote death investigators as part-time people. And I think that is a big myth because you're on call, 24/7. Kentucky's a small area. Yeah, we
Mhm.
have 120 counties.
Yeah.
And when there's counties that'll do 50 calls a year, but then there's also counties that'll do 500 calls a year or 1,000 calls a year. And it's very different in what you get. And I think that's a big problem for people to understand
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
with us, death investigation is a life
Mhm.
because in a small place you don't have a choice but to go 24/7.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and to add to that point, Mark, too, as you know, not having all those resources like a larger city, you really get good and creative at reinventing the wheel, doing more with less, and that's something that really, I think, is a big asset and value when you do transfer, somebody does transfer from that to, like a city type place. But all that experience, though, like you said, you don't necessarily get that depending on what the case volume is, in jurisdiction.
So with that, how are you guys set up? Like Kentucky, we do a coroner medical examiner system with our medical examiners being in regional offices. How do you guys work around it?
Yeah, so it's similar. There's basically kind of three main ones in Minnesota. We do have kind of the same medical examiner system where we have the main pathologists that kind of cover the metro. There's two main offices in Minnesota that kind of essentially probably take 3/4 of the counties as a whole. And then, down south, more for kind of private autopsies or less forensic, level of needs. There's a couple alternatives down south as well. But overall, there is about four, medical examiners, or four places in Minnesota that do forensic examinations outside of your basic hospital, or private autopsies.
Since you've been in the field a long time, I guess one of the biggest questions would be, what is one thing that sticks out in death investigation that if you could change, you would, and why?
That's a great question. For me personally, and as you know too, being in the field for a long time, I think just being recognized. Everybody, and like I said, you've been on fire, I've been in law enforcement, we all have kind of that kind of the background for first responders, but I think the public as a whole, and even politicians or even political people that make those decisions, whether it's budget wise or that kind of thing, they don't really understand, exactly the role that we play. Once the medical intervention is done and everybody kind of clears, we're basically walking into our scene when everybody else is kind of leaving, and that's kind of when our day starts. So for me, I think it would just be recognition, just to kind of know what we do, have the public know more about what we do. I feel like families, when they do meet us, it's usually the worst day of their lives, as you know. So if the public had more of a general kind of understanding of what we do and why we do what we do to find answers, closure, that kind of thing, I think that would probably be my number one thing I would change.
And I think that goes a lot. We've talked about this on our show. It's the public really truly does not understand everything that we go through. That's one reason we created the show.
Yeah.
Was to get the word out, because you're exactly right. There's so many places and so many people that do not understand. They think we show up and we say somebody's deceased and that's the end of the day. And it's far from the end of the day. We average, we did a thing several years ago, and it showed that on a start to finish case, we were looking at about 10 hours. Now that's increased to about 15 hours.
Mhm.
And from the time the call comes in to you sign the death certificate, you've got about 15 hours of work in there. That's a lot, especially if you take anything from a medium to large office and even small offices, because of the resources, I think. And funding is huge. We've talked about funding on here.
Yeah.
But, if you look at other emergency services, there's grants like crazy out there for that. And probably in the last 2 to 3 years is when grants really started coming through for us and for the coroner's offices and medical examiners' offices and things like that.
Yeah, I have seen a small shift, not as large as, some of the other states, at least here in Minnesota specifically. I do know too that a lot of it comes down to advocating. For me personally, as an investigator, a lot of times we would have to go through, our chief investigator and kind of up through the top. And, a lot of times we were just kind of told that, based on budget issues and that kind of thing. And honestly, even, even just to get like a cot or something that's safe for transferring people, those things eventually, that can cause injuries, as so there's a lot of things just, we're not asking for a lot, just kind of basic safe equipment, basic essentials to do our job and to do it effectively and ultimately, to help families out and help out the whole criminal justice system. And without those resources, as it makes it difficult.
And I think it does. It's when you look at those things, and I've said this over and over, I'm a huge advocate about the funding part of it and everything. And it's just the basic needs. We have coroner's offices in this state that truly supply every single thing through a funeral home to meet the needs to handle death investigations in that county.
I mean, buying gloves out of their own pocket, like
Yeah.
little things
Yeah.
like PE, they can, like, their county is not providing them with.
So I think that's huge. And I think
Mhm.
if to get into the one thing I would want to change if it was me would be the understanding of what a coroner is and and how a coroner and death investigator works through the system. We talked, one of the things that you said earlier when we were just talking back and forth was that you were helping families. One time your job was to help families. I think that's just starting to come around on the coroner side or medical examiner side, that you're starting to see that in offices. And I think that's pretty neat. That's something that I would love to had seen in our office, and something I started working on and I just never did go anywhere with it, is having people that could actually meet with families and follow that case from start to finish so they knew what was going on, because they're lost.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Mark. And as you know too, family with everything going on, they really value that continuity, whether it's an investigator, somebody like us that's kind of going through the process. I think, the biggest thing is, when we go out through, like you said, the work isn't done. We initially have to do our scene investigation, and then obviously we tell family what the process is. And afterwards, the family, even if they get the death certificate, they're going to have more questions or might have answers, and to have that same person that they can reach out to, it just makes the process so much easier and streamlined, not only for the family, because you've already built that trust and rapport, but also, the investigator, because they already know more about the case than maybe somebody else. So really, it's such an important element. And I think that more offices should do that, as you said.
I think that's starting to come. I mean, we're seeing that when I've seen there's some offices that are big enough to actually hire people on grants to do that. And I think that's really neat because, I know until you lose somebody in your family that's really close, so, a mother, father, a close family member, a child, anything like that, you're really not on that other side. And I think as death investigators, we forget that a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so people are lost. And if you have that one person to actually pick up the phone and call, that means the world to a family. And so that's a pretty neat thing. And you talked about one incident in particular when you were doing that job that you got to work with, right? And what was that?
Yeah, so between when I was at ME's office and with the state, I was able to work with victims specifically after a mass incident in Minnesota. There was something called an Annunciation Church shooting, which was essentially a mass shooting where unfortunately three young children lost their life. And part of my role with Department of Public Safety is I got to actually go out and meet with the families, let them know what resources were available as far as funding, medical bills, mental health counseling for, the children that were there. And I think just if there's one person that can kind of, explain the whole process, the resources, kind of a one-stop shop mentality. I just think that's just so vital. And for me personally, the families, I feel like they were very appreciative of that. And that's something that I like to continue seeing all states do as far as having, throw as many resources as you can, especially during mass incidents.
And I think that becomes very important, and it's resources that the family needs. So that's something that hopefully as time goes on, and I think as our profession grows, you will see that more and more, I think, in a lot of places. And that's pretty neat, really. It's something that's coming of age. I bring it to the same thing as I say, like in EMS, when I first become a paramedic, there's a lot of things. Science was just getting started then, where we actually had.
The medieval
Yeah,
ages.
back when I was typing on tablets and stuff, hitting the rocks, but there was actually nothing that was scientific about what we did. And now you look, and I've watched it evolve over all these years of EMS is a science now. And I think in turn, you're seeing as the advocacy comes, because death investigation we're our worst enemy because everybody doesn't want to talk about death. And so when nobody talks about death, then nobody knows what you do. And if you don't know what you do, then they think you do nothing a lot of times. So in turn, I think the more we advocate for us as death investigators, the more people are going to realize, wait a minute, this is an important job. As I said last week when we talked, people should demand that a coroner's office or a medical examiner's office or whatever it is be funded properly and have the equipment that they need, have everything that they need to work with. Because if it was the sheriff's office or if it was a jail or if it was whatever, they would make sure that that money was there.
Yeah,
But the coroner's office, until you need it, it really doesn't matter.
yeah.
So that's kind of my 2 cents in it.
Yeah, just to add to that real quick, you talk about kind of, the funding and that kind of thing too. I think a lot of people don't realize, the role that we play as far as, law enforcement. They can get the bad guy and they can arrest the suspect, but, the forensic community is the one that's kind of linking the dots, and obviously, larger police departments, they have the crime labs and they do the forensics as well. But just as far as, how important it is to the clues that the body give, right? Whether you're collecting trace evidence or, hair sample, if it's, defense wounds, whatever it is, the person, even though they can't speak for us, we are essentially writing their last story and collecting the evidence to be able to advocate for them, by finding the DNA sample. We're all part of the process. But I think that the public realized how important it was, forensic exams and the evidence that we collect and in the roles that the autopsy findings show. I think that they would understand how, like you said, that we're just as big of a piece of the puzzle as law enforcement, EMS, but together we can't all do it without each other, so it is one good system when it works properly.
And I think you're exactly right. It's got to collaborate.
Yeah.
And if you got that collaboration, we do good, because there's a lot of things that if we don't do our job before that body's even touched, moved, or anything, evidence is gone.
Make or break a case.
Yeah, it's going to make or break anything.
Yeah.
And so when we look at that, that's a huge thing that we have to realize that, hey, we don't want that to happen. So, don't do this, don't touch that, bag the hands, different things like that. So just for the fact that evidence doesn't get lost.
Mhm. And then, but also what we talked about earlier, knowing when to delegate another task to somebody that has a different resource, like saying, giving law enforcement a phone because they have the resources to download and go through the data on it. Whereas we could take different pictures, see if a bite mark was actually able to be placed by this person at this time, different things like that.
And that's a good point. Very good point. So let's talk a little bit about Brian Jensen Speaks. Tell me what made you want to develop this, I guess, a job now for you. I mean, it's turned into a profession just like anything else. And so tell me about Ryan Jensen Speaks, because I think that's important that people can go to your website, see what you do, about conferences, different things that you go out and speak on. So let's hear a little bit about this.
Yeah. So, the idea, started probably 10 years ago that I wanted to kind of, get into public speaking, even though, what is it? The number 2 phobia outside of heights is, speaking in front of people, something like that. But, so, for me is just, kind of we just touched on briefly is, I just felt like a lot of people didn't understand what we do, and I still feel like they don't. So if I'm able to get on the community, which I have, I do everything from drug prevention, where I'll go to talk to high school students about fentanyl, things that I see at the scene, and not so much even just a scared tactic. It's more kind of teaching about resiliency, how to make positive choices. Me personally, I lost my father at 16 to drug overdose. It was an oxy brain injury. And, that obviously, from personal perspective, really motivates me, as well as my professional perspective of kind of just seeing everything that I've seen. So when it comes to drug prevention, that's one thing that I do offer through my website. People can book me and I can come out and do school assemblies or classroom presentations. And then the other piece is just, teaching law enforcement and different agencies as far as, how we can help them. What exactly do we do? And as well as even just the, not only law enforcement, but even EMS and even firefighters and stuff too. I don't have a lot of interaction with some of those agencies because, outside of reading like the CAD report or the initial, run sheet, a lot of them I think, don't really understand exactly, what we do, as far as a detailed perspective outside of just kind of a general overview, same thing with their jobs too. So that's kind of why I started RyanJensenSpeaks.com, is just to kind of let different agencies know how, what we do, do specific training. And then the most important piece as well is for me is just, the PTSD, the stuff that firefighters, law enforcement, last responders, public safety, EMS, basically the whole field that we're in, when you go home at night, it's difficult to shut it off, as you know, we're all kind of adrenaline junkies in a way, and you get home and all of a sudden, sometimes things seem boring, and that's something I like to talk about with law enforcement and other professionals in our field is, it's normal to feel this way. This is what I did. I started a landscaping company 7 years ago because when I got off work from 24-hour shifts, I want to be outside. I want to get my mind off of it. It ended up turning in from a nice side hobby to a something I do 4 months of the year. So, just to talk to people about different things as far as what we do, drug prevention, as well as specific training, are all things that I'm looking to continue to grow through my website.
And you talked about like, especially drug prevention. I think drug prevention in any part of the country is huge.
Mm-hmm.
What we see and what in our area is we kind of in probably 2007, 8 up to about 2012 is when we saw pill mills. And these were prescription medications that this area was absolutely overrun by. And our numbers were astronomical for our area. And I think me and you've talked about that a couple of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we have a population of about 49,000 for our county, and we average out about 35 to 40 overdose deaths a year. And per capita, we rank in probably the top 5.
Yeah.
So, we went through all these spills. We saw the pill mills, and then we shut that down, or helped shut that down, I should say. And then, then all of a sudden we had this lull. And then we went into heroin coming to town. And heroin wasn't really bad. I mean, we had some deaths, but it wasn't nothing like when fentanyl come to town.
Mhm.
And when fentanyl first come, it became huge. And
Yeah.
so what we see a lot of times is these spinoffs of the fentanyls. And if there's a will, there's a way. And I always say that. So, from there, then we went into the methamphetamines. And when we saw true meth in this county, we saw violence. We saw a lot of homicides, different things like that we hadn't seen in a long time. And those homicides were usually by sharp force instruments instead of gunshots or something like that. And then now we're back on meth and fentanyls and combinations of this and combinations of that. What do you all see out in your area? What really in your law enforcement career, what have you seen and how's that trend worked?
Yeah, so kind of what you touched on earlier, where heroin, was pretty big, and then like you said, kind of meth and transitive fentanyl. For me specifically, especially in a city like St. Paul, I say fentanyl is obviously, number one. As they're cutting and everything, so it goes further. And everybody likes the pure form because it gets a better, a better hit form. Um, you know, I've actually, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, but we actually had a couple cases. This was probably about 4 years ago now, where I went out to two separate scenes, but they were actually within about 3 week time frame from each other. And it was actually carfentanil. And and as you know, and your audience, but essentially, the elephant tranquilizer, it only takes, it's basically 1,000 times more potent than even some of the fentanyl and morphine out there, and I had two individuals that actually, they were using and didn't know it was laced with carfentanil. And when I actually got out to the scene, they both were laying on top of each other. That's how quick it was. And I had to get the full Tyvek suit on. I had an ambulance on standby. And then with that dose, within a couple weeks of that, kind of the same general area, we had another person that had carfentanil as well. And and so I've seen a little bit of that. And then obviously now there's even more stuff, but typically fentanyl is probably most what I've seen, outside of your, typical, prescription drugs.
The carfentanil we've seen here, we saw it probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Huntington, West Virginia. What gets us is where we're kind of in a tri-state area. we see it kind of starts in Huntington and then works its way down, or it starts in Portsmouth, Ohio, and works its way down. And so in Huntington, in a 4 hour period, they had 28 overdoses and 4 deaths.
Wow.
That was, and it's a town that brings in a lot of dealers from your Michigans and
We
your
have a
Ohio.
bus stop as well.
Yeah, so we got a good bus stop, and they always bring us customers and things like that. So we end up with that a lot, and so we're seeing that now. We're seeing the spinoffs of the carfentanyls with a lot of tranquilizers, veterinarian tranquilizer stuff, things like that. That really we'll see on a tox, and what we usually do is we'll see it, and it'll be in the toxicology, and then we'll see a string of it, and then it'll stop. And then it may be 6 months later, we'll see another string of something and it will stop. So we see that is what we've been seeing lately anyways.
Wow.
So we have changed all of our tactics as far as like, we bring somebody up to our morgue and we're examining the body. We always now have two persons in the morgue. So we have to work in there. We have Narcan at the office. All that stuff kind of comes in and plays with what we do in our jobs. And so I'm sure you see that too.
Yeah, and like you said too, from a PPE perspective too, we do carry Narcan as well. It's and that's another thing too that talking about what like people understand is I don't think they understand even just the environmental hazards that we're exposed to. Not only being on like if it's a traffic accident, being on the side of the road, at 2 in the morning, or like you said, going into a scene and having an unknown white substance that if you move wrong or it gets disturbed, you could breathing that in. And that's something too that going back to the legislation thing too is I hope that people in all states at the higher levels that are making those decisions can see that we are exposed to a lot as well. Even going to some parts of every city has their parts, but going out at 2 in the morning and crowd control sometimes is difficult, and you don't always know who the people around the scene are, and those are all factors that unless you're carrying and concealing, which I personally don't at a scene, those are things that I think people need to be aware about as well.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that is different in Kentucky because we are considered law enforcement under KRS. So
Okay.
oh yes, we always have a weapon on, just like any other law enforcement agency. But the scenes are getting more and more dangerous too. In Tennessee, I think they had an investigator a couple of months ago that was actually shot that was working the scene, and everybody kind of left and they were doing their job, and the perpetrator came back and shot that investigator. And so that was just recent. So you see things like that. So I think one of the things that you're doing with your company is great because I think it does get the word out to us, to law enforcement, to fire departments, whoever you're talking to, because we have to do that on a one-on-one thing. A lot of times we'll go to EMS and we have a presentation that we'll put on of what to do, what not to do, how not to disturb the body, different things like that. And it works really well for us.
That's so important. Yeah, that's great that you guys do that.
So what else do you want? What do you want the public to know about you or about your company or anything like that?
Yeah, just, no matter if you're, working with domestic violence victims or a law enforcement agency or even just a school system, I love sharing my experience with people. I like telling stories. I keep it, professional. I don't use names, but I think stories and different scenarios are how we all learn. And the biggest thing is if anybody's looking for just somebody that is compassionate and really wants to help people and share their experiences, I love to hear from you. And I'm willing to travel pretty much anywhere in the US if you have any upcoming conferences or need a keynote or anything like that. So
That's great. So again, RonJensenSpeaks.com. That's where you can find him at. And Ron, we really appreciate you coming on this week and giving your perspective on what death investigation is and learning more about you and about your company.
Mark, thank you so much for having me. And like I said, big fan of your show. And if you ever have season 3 or 4 and you want me back, just let me know. Be glad to come back.
We will
Good.
gladly, yeah, we'll gladly have you back.
Oh, and thank you for all you guys do. Like I said, you guys, it takes a village. It really does.
So, this is something we want to do, and we decided to try, and it seems like it's worked good. Hopefully, the fans really like this, and we can have more people on. And this opens up the door so much more
Yeah.
for our show to where we can give different perspectives as we move forward with the show itself. So that's what we're looking to do. So we really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Great.
Oh, okay. Last thing. This was a very cool episode. We appreciate you guys for being here. We appreciate Ryan again for being our first guest on the show. We also want to say thank you to our sponsors for making this episode happen again with SCU Services, that's Scene Cleanup Services, but they don't just do scenes, they do all types of different cases, hoarding, just anything you can think of, they will work with you to clean up. Valor Services is also another company that does the exact same thing. They serve the entire nation. I don't think that they're just Kentucky wide. So
Yeah, they're opened up everywhere,
yeah,
all
they're open
across the
everywhere.
United States.
So anything you need, call one of those companies and they will get you handled. And we appreciate your time. We appreciate you continuing to support us. Keep following us on social medias and get the word out.